take a breath together. As we know, today's Father's Day. It's also the solstice, so it's a very powerful day. Yesterday was Juneteenth. It's a very, very powerful weekend energetically. So in my next 20 minutes or so, I will do my best to share something or offer this talk, hopefully as a value to all of you. The focus is Father's Day. Let's see how this comes out. I guess I want to give a talk that primarily honors my dad. Now, it's maybe true for many of us. Some of us didn't even know our dads or our biological fathers, or we were raised by other father figures. And kind of the focus of my talk is a theme that I've been working with called tragedy and treasure. You know, as we may know, lots of parts of our lives have both tragedies. I mean, as a transformational therapist and just a human, I call myself, I'm in humanity rehab. As someone who is recovering from the tragedies of my humanity, but also learning to really cherish the treasures of my humanity. There was lots of, I had both in my relationship with my dad. I was fortunate to grow up and be raised by my biological father and my biological mother. They did divorce or begin separating when I was 16. But fortunately, they were both healthy enough people that they made a conscious effort to get along well enough that they could stay, in our lives. And even though my parents separated and divorced, they were still very strong in our lives in terms of graduations and weddings and all that stuff, which was really, quite remarkable and wonderful. I really give my parents a lot of credit for that. One of the other treasures, even though my parents had their issues like all people do, they were never verbally abusive to us. We were never told we were stupid. If anything, we were really supported to be, encouraged to experience our value. But granted, our parents had their limitations. If anything, like I said, there was certainly never, verbal abuse. My dad, came from one of the generations where they believed in spankings, and that was kind of the abuse that I experienced, although there was what I'll call neglect. Neglect is a form of abuse. And neglect in a way, and it was just my parents being, humans that just didn't know any better for their time. I feel like my dad was somewhat emotionally insecure. He didn't know how, it's this whole new thing about emotional intelligence that a lot of us are learning and working with, learning how to feel our feelings, identify our feelings, express our feelings, and particularly have, the difficult feelings of vulnerability and own our anger in a responsible way. There's lots of different things. And in some ways, my father was not as skilled with that. And that's the biggest reason my mom at some point decided she needed to leave him, because he just was not, as some men are, and let's give lots of credit to men because our culture doesn't encourage men to be feeling. He didn't really know how to be more emotionally available, and my mom needed more of that in a partner. But again, the one of the biggest tragedies in my life was, again, I just came from a generation where they believed in spankings, and my dad spanked me twice. But it was traumatic for me, granted, gratefully, I was not more physically abused or verbally abused or sexually abused or anything like that. But, I'm a sensitive being, as many of us are. We have these sensitive bodies, sensitive feelings, sensitive hearts, sensitive minds. And, the part of the good news was my dad practically worshiped me. I mean, when my parents got together, my mom got pregnant as a single woman and gave birth to my sister, Jody, my older sister. And then my parents got married when Jody was 2. And then I came along. And so I was my dad's first child. And I think, I practiced something called intuitive memory. So as I intuit into my memories and my feelings, what felt true for me was, as many of us struggle with our value in life, and especially in these previous generations when people didn't talk about their feelings that much. I mean, back then, people were just worried about surviving the wars, the World War One, World War Two, and making a living, going through the Depression, that kind of thing. Having feelings and being sensitive was kind of a luxury, and again, especially for men. So we want to give a lot of credit to men and our fathers and our grandfathers who survived, and maintained, some form of emotional health and kept families together and that kind of thing. So, again, my dad didn't feel as emotionally sensitive. And so when, I was his I was his best creation. I came along and I was like, wow, here was a creation that he literally had made through his body at some level. And, and I think that, emotionally I was safe because I was a baby. I was like, I couldn't leave, and, so in some ways I was probably one of the first beings and that he was really able to fully open his heart to, again, mainly because as a infant, I couldn't leave, so, that in some ways that was a treasure. I felt so loved, like I said, almost practically worshiped. He literally called me growing up, he called me something special. So gratefully, I got a lot of value. I felt really loved and cherished. And another tragedy in my life, I feel like in some ways was, that my mom and sister were very bonded. They kind of came as a package. And when I was born, I also feel like my dad wanted a boy. He wanted a little mini me. Well, I think I tried to be a boy for him, but I, came out in a female body. But it was difficult. So I have gender issues and that kind of thing, but, I'm continuing to heal that and resolve that. But I became, I was sort of like the peace offering in the family because from the beginning, unfortunately, there was strife between my parents and, they just didn't know how to deal with it any better. So I became my dad's, companion. So there was my mom and sister on one side, my dad and I on the other side, and kind of helped balance out the family. But so in some ways there was a tragedy to that because I felt like in order to be loyal to my dad, I had to take some space from my mom. So I didn't grow up as very close to my mom, even though we still all grew up in the same house and that kind of thing. But, being close to my dad, even though I, again, sacrificed some attention and time with my mom and some mothering, which I have now reclaimed, my mom and I now have a very close relationship. My dad taught me many, many things. He taught me to hammer and nail. He taught me to swim in the ocean. He taught me how to boat. He taught me, how to ski, how to clean a fish tank. He taught me how to blacktop a driveway, how to play basketball, how to mow the lawn, how to eat a chestnut. I mean, there's so many things that he taught me, and I'm grateful. He taught me how to fix things. He taught me appreciation for nature. He loved music. There's just he was a jokester and a storyteller. That he really, in many ways, was a really wonderful man. He was intelligent. He gave me an appreciation for math. He was funny. He loved to entertain. He was hardworking. He was generous. He was gracious. There was many, many, many beautiful qualities about him. So again, here is, life, the tragedies and the treasures. So, one of the other beautiful things that, so in my life, in some ways I've struggled with, because these spankings that I had really that were, started when I was around 5 years old, even though for him, what I've learned now through my practices, my hypnotherapy, my intuitive memory is I've really been able to learn that, a lot of it was, as we know, people who are in pain and don't know how to manage their pain responsibly, which who knew how to do that back then, unfortunately at times take it out on others, which it can include children. And, and I realized that, it was a Saturday and he might've been having a bad day. He probably felt separated from my mom in some way, that, the pain of not knowing how to be closer and emotionally connected with my mom. And, when I was just a normal 5-year-old, trying to take space and do my thing, he got upset because, he wanted me to be with him and spanked me for the first time. And it was relatively traumatic. And, what I didn't know at that time was because, again, when you've had, when I went from feeling completely, practically cherished and worshipped to, it was a form of physical assault, that, and it wasn't even just the actual physical spanking part, but the emotional part. And there was a emotional humiliation thing. I think there was strife between my sister and I, and after he spanked me and put me in the corner in the living room, I think one of what I didn't know then, what I have discovered and learned through my intuitive memory now, is that, I was terrified that my sister was going to come down and see me in this emotionally traumatic state and punished in the corner. And it was all very difficult emotionally, and the shame and all that kind of stuff. And so it's a difficult experience, but I've gone on as an adult to become what I call a transformational therapist, which is, doing therapeutic work. I'm not traditionally trained. I do more of the new age work, hypnotherapy and breath work, and something called consciousness management and that kind of thing, which is really just learning how to manage what we call our experience, our mental part, the emotional part, and how all that runs through our physical body. It's wonderful that there's more and more work going on these days in terms of how to do trauma resolution, because all of us have experienced either direct physical, sexual, mental, emotional, relational, and even just trauma of living in the world, living in a world where there's war and racism and discrimination and all kinds of things that are not healthy for us as spiritual beings in particular, because the spiritual part of us is grounded in peace and love and balance and happiness. And it's like, so it's wow. Oh, we were in pain, or we fear, or we have abandonment issues. We have all kinds of stuff. But the good news about the transformational therapy is that we can learn to resolve these things. Like, experiences can actually be neutralized. And I have done a lot of work with my dad, and not directly. He passed in 2003, 18 years ago. And we really, unfortunately, never, while he was alive, knew how to speak directly. Now, of course, I also, back in 1980s, I guess, mid-80s, I moved away from home finally and moved to Arizona and then here to San Francisco. So even though we were in each other's lives and saw each other maybe once or twice a year, we never really did our emotional work in person, in the bodies together. So I've had to do a lot of my healing work with him while he's been in spirit, and it works. We know from our, I think it's spiritual principle, guiding principle number 8, that, healing and reformation is still available to both the living and the dead. So we can, since as spiritualists, and that's I think a real benefit to being spiritualists, we know that we can still connect with those on the other side, and particularly if it's people we need to do forgiveness work with. It's available, so especially through practices like hypnotherapy, where one of the beauties about hypnotherapy is, the mind doesn't know the difference between reality and what we call fantasy. So, I've done work where, that first day that, he did my first spanking, I have gone back to, the scene of the crime and, and imagined him more embodied and more loving, literally getting down on his knee so that he was at my height, my little 5-year-old height, and apologizing and saying he didn't understand, and he apologized for his reactivity and his anger. And, we've done a lot of healing. So that's been really beautiful and powerful, and it's possible, and it really helps, neutralize and keep clearing the difficult feelings that I've had in my heart, mind, and soul. So that's, great and wonderful. I'm going to give a little plug here to Offset as well, especially since she's coming up as our medium. I had the privilege of getting a reading from Offset a couple of weeks ago, and one of the persons that came through was my grandfather. This was my mom's father. And he, also, we weren't really personally close. I mean, he was in my life. I saw him holidays and that kind of thing, but I wasn't really taught to have, close relationships with my elders. I was taught I was given a very strong message, like many of us was, respect your elders. And it was so strong in my family that I didn't even know I had to sort of just go along. And even though, he wasn't my direct father, he was my grandfather. So there was forms of fathering. And one of the things that, one of the other tragedies, the traumas that happened with my grandfather is, and I know he thought he was joking, but I don't know if I had shared this in the previous talks, but one time, we used to get together, and my mom had two sisters, and there was a bunch of cousins, and we were all over at my grandparents' house. And my grandfather was joking, and he said he was, and I don't know whether he was really trying, whether he was just joking or whether he was really trying to help us behave. He said something like, if you don't behave or follow the rules, something like that, we'll send you to the orphanage or something like that, which, I think in reality, my grandparents would never have sent any of us away. I mean, that was not a reality. But I didn't know that. My sensitive system took in that if I didn't toe the line, I didn't really pay attention and do what they wanted, that I could potentially be sent away. And my system somehow believed that, and that was difficult for me. So I was so, my grandfather was scary to me in that way. I was like, I didn't know how to really fully embrace him, even though he was a loving person. That was a scary experience for me. And one of the things that has happened, he has come through now more than once. And again, recently in my reading with Osset, that he came through. And also one of the beauties about my grandparents and my dad is they were all very spiritually devout. My grandparents lived on the same block as their church. They were very involved in their church. They were a little too Christian puritanical for me. They believed in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. I definitely embrace Jesus as a teacher, but I don't see, that's not my path. And my dad also was a churchgoer and very devout, and he taught me an appreciation for spirit, almost like he taught me an appreciation for nature. And now my grandfather has come through many times, and his message to me has been, I really never knew who you were. I really never understood what you were about, but I can see what you're doing and what you're about, and I appreciate that. And I particularly got, in that message from Osset recently, that in a way he and I are the same. We are devoted to spirit, and even though we took different paths and did it differently, that in that way our hearts were in the same place. So it was a really beautiful message from my grandfather, and again, it helps me relieve some of that old energy, because as I was saying, that old energy can be relieved. So in getting ready to wrap up here, again, I guess my invitation to each of us in our own ways, maybe some of us did have relationships with dads or grandfathers or other elders that were completely like, Leave It to Beaver kind of, the Hallmark movies where, your dads and your moms and your elders are all just always loving and generous and there. I don't know if that's reality, but maybe some of us had that, but very likely many of us probably had very mixed relationships with our elders, again, in terms of being exposed to the tragedies of life, the difficulties of, adults raising children. I kind of sometimes joke, I'm going to start a support group called Whack Whack, which is Wounded Adult Children of Wounded Adult Children, because very likely many of our elders were also people, we know this, who were in pain or traumatized or struggling, with their humanity, struggling to live lives with open hearts and happiness and that kind of thing. So, many of us, the truth in our humanity is we have been exposed to the tragedies of life, but what's also in there are treasures, and tragedies can become treasures. So, I think, if anything, I'll give gratitude on this Father's Day for my father and my grandfather and my other grandfather. My father's father died when I was 8, and I didn't have, again, a very close relationship with him, but we come from our ancestors. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be here. And, there's probably a way that we can just, in our hearts and minds, even right now, just remind ourselves that in every moment, every breath they took, every struggle they had, whether it was around health or finances or relationships or just staying alive, all the different places that our ancestors had struggles, with life, that, if it wasn't for their faith or their trust or even the places where, maybe they didn't make it or something, that if it wasn't for those energies run through us, that without them, we certainly wouldn't be here. So Again, to just give gratitude, for my dad, all his trials and tribulations, all his greatness, all his weakness, all the places he took the high road, or what I call the heart road, or, the places where he didn't think he did so well. That we all do the best we can. We all do the best we can. And, to remind ourselves, because each of us could probably, I actually the other day was anticipating this talk and sat down and wrote about 8 pages of my dad's story, which is not really the talk that I gave today. There's so much about his life that was remarkable and incredible. So I just want to give gratitude again for him, as a human being, a beautiful man, a man who, like everybody else, just did the best they could to pursue their happiness, and sometimes did well and sometimes did not do so well. But in each of us, we can bring these places together. We can bring the tragedies and the treasures together and forgive. It's important to forgive. One of my teachers say, forgive, but don't forget. People have there's that phrase, forgive and forget. Well, he taught us forgive, but don't forget. It's like if you've made mistakes or done things in places in life, it's important to remember so that we don't step in those same potholes again to the best of our ability. But in essence, what is beautiful about us as spiritualists is, to the extent that we believe in life after life, there's a place where we can identify as that eternal spirit that we are, and know that in the end, it's not about the spankings, and it's not about the neglect, and it's not about the worship. It's about reminding ourselves that what's truly eternal, that lives on, and really that's the love in our hearts, and that everything can be forgiven, because in spirit there is no death, there is no loss, and we can identify with just the pure, eternal, divine spirit that of love that we are. So I hope there's been something in this talk that's been valuable for you. And I just want to say again, happy Father's Day and happy solstice, and blessings.